Picture this. You're standing in the middle of a brutal, just completely unforgiving desert on the Iranian plateau.
Right, so it's incredibly hot.
Oh, yeah. It is the height of summer. The sun is just beating down, the air is thick with dust, and the temperature is hovering somewhere around like a blistering 110 degrees Fahrenheit.
Which is barely survivable if you're out in the open.
Exactly. But you walk toward this massive, stepped, conical dome rising out of the sand, and it's made entirely of mud brick. You step through a low doorway, out of that searing heat and into the dark.
And this is where it gets crazy.
It really is. Because as your eyes adjust, you realize the air in this building is frigid. You look down into this subterranean trench, and you see blocks of solid ice.
Ice.
Solid ice. In the middle of the desert, in the middle of the summer.
I mean, it sounds like science fiction or at least some kind of modern thermodynamic trick, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But the people pulling ice out of that dome, which by the way is called a yakchal, were doing it over 2,000 years ago.
See, that image fundamentally breaks how we tend to think about the ancient world. We always fall into this trap of believing that complex, world-spanning infrastructure, the kind of systems that manage global supply chains and environmental engineering, is a uniquely modern invention.
Yeah, we think we invented all the smart logistical stuff yesterday.
Right. But today, we are going on a deep dive into this massive stack of sources. We've got historical timelines, archaeological notes, research excerpts, and they absolutely shatter that assumption. We're exploring the ancient Iranian civilizations.
Covering a really incredible span of time, too. We're talking from 2000 BC all the way to 300 AD.
And our mission today is to trace what I can really only describe as the ultimate pendulum swing of empire.
It is a pendulum in the truest sense. If you look at the Iranian plateau over this 2 millennia stretch, you aren't looking at a single static civilization that just gets a little bit bigger every century.
No, it's constantly changing.
Radically changing. You are watching a region of isolated, scattered mountain valleys evolve into a literal global superpower. And they didn't just find one blueprint and stick to it.
These ancient empires were the original beta testers for those exact problems. I mean, they experimented with every imaginable form of governance. They built these hyper-centralized, top-down bureaucracies with strict audits.
And when that broke, because it did break.
Oh, it completely broke. And when it did, they swung completely to the other side. They experimented with incredibly loose, decentralized feudal alliances. They tested the absolute limits of open-armed religious pluralism, and then they tested the crushing weight of rigid state orthodoxy.
And the stakes were infinitely higher back then. The problems they were solving in antiquity are the foundational problems of human organization.
Right, like how do you manage the flow of information across thousands of miles of hostile terrain?
Exactly. Or how do you extract taxes to fund a massive military without utterly bankrupting your own farmers?
Or how do you impose a central authority on dozens of distinct ancient cultures without triggering constant massive rebellions every other week?
Right. So to understand how the Persians eventually solved, or, well, failed to solve those massive logistical nightmares, we can't just start with the famous emperors.
No, we have to look at the people who built the foundation first. The pre-Achaemenid era, spanning roughly 2000 BC to 550 BC. And our sources make it very clear that the Iranian plateau was not some empty waiting room just waiting for an empire to arrive.
Far from it, yeah. The geography of the plateau is critical here. It's this expansive high-altitude basin surrounded by towering, rugged mountain ranges, the Zagros to the west, the Elburz to the north.
It sounds pretty inhospitable on paper.
It does, but within those mountains, you have these incredibly fertile intermontane valleys, and human beings recognize the value of those valleys very early on.
Right, because if we look at the archaeological notes for a site called Tepe Sialk, which is near modern-day Kashan, there is evidence of sophisticated human habitation stretching as far back as 3500 BC.
And the sources mention monumental ziggurats being built there.
Which is wild. This isn't just a few scattered tents. I mean, a ziggurat requires thousands of hours of organized labor, brick-making, architectural planning.
It requires a massive surplus of food to feed all those builders, which means they had highly advanced agriculture. And they weren't isolated either.
No, they had trade routes.
Right. Further southeast, you have the site of Jiroft. The research points to Jiroft functioning as a remarkably wealthy transit hub. They were already moving luxury goods and directing transit traffic toward eastern markets.
So the plateau was already a vibrant, interconnected web of settlements long before the major empires ever formed.
Exactly. But the real heavyweights in those early days, specifically in the southwestern part of the plateau, were the Elamites.
The Elamites. They are centered at Susa, down in the lowlands, and at a highland city called Enshin in the southern Zagros. And they are a total historical anomaly.
They really are. Our notes emphasize that they were ethnically and linguistically distinct from literally everyone around them.
Yeah, they are one of the great mysteries of the ancient Near East. The Elamite language is a complete isolate.
And for anyone who doesn't know, in linguistics, an isolate means that the language has absolutely no known genetic relationship to any other language on Earth.
Which is just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
They weren't speaking a Semitic language like their Mesopotamian neighbors to the west, and they weren't speaking an Indo-European language like the Iranian tribes who would eventually arrive from the north.
Right, which means they developed their culture in a highly unique silo. And yet, they managed to become this incredibly dominant force. They even developed their own written cuneiform script by 3000 BC.
But they weren't just sitting behind their walls ignoring the rest of the world, right? The sources describe them as a critical cultural conduit.
Yeah, they function as the bridge between the ancient, highly developed bureaucracies of Mesopotamia and the emerging, less structured groups on the Iranian plateau.
So they were sort of translating civilization for the highlands.
Essentially, yeah. The Elamites absorbed Mesopotamian administrative practices, architectural styles, and record-keeping systems. Then they adapted them to their own isolate culture and utilized them to manage their own complex state.
But that state doesn't last forever. The geopolitical reality of the ancient world is just incredibly violent, and the Elamites have the extreme misfortune of living next door to the Neo-Assyrian Empire.
Yeah, that is a bad neighbor to have.
The worst. In 640 BC, the Neo-Assyrian king Ashurbanipal launches a campaign that completely devastates the Neo-Elamite state.
And it is vital to understand the scale of that devastation. Ashurbanipal didn't just defeat their army, he waged a campaign of total structural erasure.
It was apocalyptic for them.
Completely. He systematically sacked the capital of Susa, looted its temples, and deliberately destroyed the agricultural infrastructure that sustained the population.
The sources say he salted the fields.
Salted the fields, dismantled the irrigation networks, and just left the lowlands in absolute ruins.
Which obviously creates a massive structural void. You have this complex society that has suddenly had its head cut off and its lifeblood drained. And as we all know, geopolitics abhors a vacuum.
Right, so someone is going to move in.
Exactly. While the Elamite state is collapsing, you have these nomadic and semi-nomadic Indo-Iranian pastoralists. These are the early Persian tribes who have been slowly filtering into the southern Zagros Mountains. They see this vacuum in the Anshan region, and they move right in.
But they don't do what the Assyrians did. They don't arrive with a scorched earth policy. Instead, you see a phenomenon that the sources call the Perso-Elamite synthesis.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I want to dig into how that synthesis actually worked. It sets the entire tone to what the Persian identity becomes. Early Persian leaders, like a king named Tispace, they don't just conquer the Elamites and force them to speak Persian.
No, they recognize the value of the existing administrative machinery. These nomadic tribes didn't have a deep tradition of complex urban bureaucracy.
Right, they were herdsmen and warriors.
Exactly. But the Elamites had that bureaucracy. So the early Persian kings adopt the Elamite scribal language to keep their records. They take on traditional Elamite administrative titles.
It's like they're trying on the suit of the previous management.
That's a great way to put it. They essentially wear the institutional clothing of the civilization they are absorbing.
So it's a merger, not a hostile acquisition. They are building a hybrid culture that marries the martial nomadic energy of the Indo-Iranians with the ancient bureaucratic sophistication of the Elamites.
And this is happening in the south.
Right.
Yeah.
But to understand the full picture, we have to look north to a region called Media, centered around ancient Ecbatana, which is modern-day Hamadan. Because the situation up there was entirely different.
Very different. In the mountainous northwest, you have other Indo-Iranian pastoralists, the Medes. But unlike the south, there is no ancient cohesive state for them to absorb.
There's no Elamite bureaucracy waiting for them.
Nope. Through the 9th and 8th centuries DC, Media is characterized by extreme political fragmentation.
The sources mention that Neo-Assyrian inscriptions referred to the leaders in Media as Baal Ali, which translates to city lords or chieftains.
Yeah, the geography of Media, with its rugged mountains and isolated valleys, just naturally encouraged localized power. You didn't have a single king. You had dozens, perhaps hundreds of these chieftains, each controlling a localized, fortified node.
So they were fiercely independent clans
Fiercely territorial, yeah, and they operated largely in isolation from one another.
until they're forced not to be. Because those same Neo-Assyrians who destroyed the Elamites are constantly pushing into Median territory too. They're launching raids, demanding tribute, and generally terrorizing these isolated clans.
And this is where we see the first real structural innovation.
Right, because the Medes realize that if they stay fragmented, they will just be picked off one by one. So they form an alliance. But it's not an empire yet, is it?
No, and that is a critical distinction that modern historians have had to clarify. Older historical models assumed there was this vast, rigidly structured Median empire, but the actual evidence points to something much more fluid.
It was a decentralized tribal confederation.
Exactly.
I like to think of it as a massive neighborhood watch program forged out of pure survival. I mean, they don't unify because one guy had a grand vision of world domination. They unify because the Assyrians are literally burning their farms.
That's spot on. They build a pyramidal loyalty network where smaller clans pledge temporary allegiance to a more powerful chieftain solely for the purpose of mutual defense.
But how did such a decentralized, loose alliance manage to take down the mighty Neo-Assyrian Empire? I mean, a neighborhood watch doesn't usually take over the city.
Well, what's fascinating here is the mechanism of change. Decentralized networks are highly adaptable. When they are pressured by an external force like Assyria, they don't just endure the pressure, they innovate.
Okay, how so?
Under Median leaders like Shreartes, and later his son Cyaxares in the late 7th century BC, the Medes realized that traditional tribal raiding tactics won't defeat a professional Assyrian army.
Right, you can't just run at them yelling.
Exactly. So they restructure. The sources specifically note that they organize their forces into distinct, specialized ranks: cavalry, archers, and spear bearers. They impose strict military discipline on a nomadic framework.
Think about the logistical leap that requires. You are taking independent herdsmen and tribal warriors who are used to fighting for, personal glory or local disputes, and you are training them to hold a line.
Training them to coordinate cavalry charges with archer volleys.
He transformed a loose confederation into a highly lethal, combined arms military machine.
And it works almost too well.
It really does. This defensive neighborhood watch gets so organized and so lethal that they decide to just take the fight to the bully. In 612 BC, the Medes form a strategic alliance with Nabopolassar of Babylonia, and they march on the Neo-Assyrian Empire.
And they actually sack the Assyrian capital of Nineveh.
Which is unbelievable. This decentralized, temporary alliance of mountain tribes manages to obliterate the most entrenched, terrifying superpower of the ancient Near East.
It's a stunning geopolitical upset. But it leaves the Medes in a very strange position. They suddenly control vast territories, but they are still fundamentally operating on a loose, decentralized tribal network.
Right. They haven't built the administrative state required to govern what they've just conquered.
Which creates the perfect opening. You have the Medes in the north, possessing massive military power, but lacking administrative glue.
And you have the Persians in the south, who have successfully hybridized with the Elamites and absorbed an ancient bureaucratic tradition.
Exactly. This sets the stage for a visionary leader to look at these two pieces, put them together, and build something unprecedented.
Enter Cyrus the Great,
The founder of the Achaemenid Empire.
the first true global superpower. In 550 BC, Cyrus, who is a Persian, overthrows his Median overlord, Astyages. But he doesn't just crush the Medes. He unites the Medes and the Persians under his own dynasty.
And then he goes on this explosive campaign of conquest, taking over Lydia in Asia Minor, capturing Babylon, and expanding his borders at a pace that must have seemed incomprehensible to the people living through it.
But conquering a territory is only like 10% of the work, right? The real challenge is governance.
Oh, absolutely. And Cyrus understood that you cannot impose a rigid, top-down cultural system on a multi-state empire that spans from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River.
Yeah, the moment you force everyone to speak one language or worship one god, the entire structure just shatters.
Right, so his strategy relies on balancing absolute central authority with remarkable regional tolerance. The Cyrus Cylinder is the most famous example of this.
When he conquers Babylon, he doesn't destroy their temples. He patronizes their local cults.
He allows exiled peoples to return home. He actively cultivates an image of a liberator rather than a conqueror.
But while Cyrus was the visionary conqueror, the man who actually built the machine that kept the empire running was his successor, Darius the Great, who ruled from 522 to 486 BC.
Darius is the true architect of the Achaemenid administrative state.
And Darius realizes that tolerance alone isn't going to pay the bills or, stop ambitious generals from trying to take his throne. He needs structure.
So he regularizes the entire empire into 20 provinces, known as satrapies. And the way he engineers the power dynamics within these satrapies is an absolute masterclass in risk management.
It is entirely designed around preventing rebellion.
Yes. In each province, Darius appoints a civil governor, the satrap or Jusapavan in Old Persian. The satrap's job is extensive. They oversee the general administration, they manage the judicial system, they maintain the roads, and they collect the taxes.
They're the supreme civil authority.
Right, but they are missing one crucial tool.
The military. The satrap is explicitly denied direct command of the imperial military garrison stationed in their own province.
Precisely. The imperial troops reported to independent military commanders who answered directly to the great king in Susa or Persepolis.
I find this brilliant. You give a guy the keys to the treasury, the courts, and the bureaucracy, he feels incredibly powerful. But you do not give him the keys to the armory.
By deliberately splitting civil and military power, Darius ensured that neither official could launch a successful rebellion on their own. The satrap has the money, but no troops. The general has the troops, but no money to feed or pay them.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Darius doesn't even trust that balance of power to hold on its own. He layers a massive auditing system on top of it. He installs a king's secretary in every province to monitor the satrap's correspondence.
And then he creates this specialized group of mobile royal inspectors that the source is literally referred to as the eyes and ears of the king.
They are the original corporate compliance department.
Exactly. These inspectors would travel the empire, showing up completely unannounced at the satrapal capitals. They would audit the tax records, investigate complaints from the locals, and ensure that the satrap wasn't secretly building a power base.
It's an incredibly sophisticated system of checks and balances designed to maintain absolute centralized control over a massive geography.
And to make this machine efficient, Darius standardized the economy. Before him, revenue was often collected in the form of ad hoc tribute or gifts like grain, livestock, slaves. It was very unpredictable.
But in 519 BC, Darius replaced this with a sustainable, standardized tax system.
He sent surveyors across the empire to measure the land, assess soil fertility, and estimate crop yields, and he assigned a fixed annual tax burden to every satrapy.
Which sounds, from a purely administrative standpoint, incredibly modern and fair. You tax people based on the actual productive capacity of their land. And to grease the wheels of this new economy, they introduce a standardized currency. The sources detail the gold daric and the silver sigillus.
But this is where the pendulum of centralized power reveals its first fatal flaw. You have a highly efficient tax collection machine pulling wealth from the provinces. But what does the central government do with that wealth once they collect it?
They hoard it. The sources are very clear about this. The Achaemenid state took all of this standardized silver tax revenue and essentially locked it in a vault.
They accumulated massive, unimaginable reserves of billion at the central treasuries in Susa and Persepolis.
But if they were so tolerant and brilliant, why were regular people falling into brutal debt slavery just to pay taxes?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look at the mechanics of macroeconomics. Hoarding on that scale is catastrophic for a local economy. The Achaemenids had created a system where taxes had to be paid in silver coin.
Right.
But because the central government was continually pulling silver out of circulation and hoarding it, there was a severe shortage of currency in the provinces.
It triggers massive deflation. The everyday people, especially in highly monetized, commercially active regions like Babylonia, suddenly find themselves in a desperate situation. The tax bill is due, the king demands silver, but there is literally no silver circulating in the local markets.
So how do you pay your taxes? You have to borrow. This systemic liquidity crisis gave rise to powerful private banking families. The sources explicitly mention the Morshu and Ajibi families in Babylonia.
These entities stepped in to fill the void, functioning as private lenders.
But they aren't lending out of the goodness of their hearts. They are charging exorbitant interest rates. We're talking about an ancient banking crisis fueled entirely by state-mandated deflation.
It's awful. A local landholder whose farm is producing plenty of barley but no silver has to mortgage his ancestral land to the Murashu family just to get the siglos needed to pay the satrap.
And if there's a drought the next year or a pestilence and the crop fails, the landholder can't pay the interest on the loan.
The bank forecloses on the farm. And if the value of the farm doesn't cover the debt, The landholder and his family are forced into debt slavery.
This is the dark side of that brilliant centralized bureaucracy. They built an incredible machine for extracting wealth, but they lacked a mechanism for injecting that liquidity back into the provincial economies. They were literally cannibalizing their own tax base.
It's a fascinating disconnect. On a macroeconomic scale, they were blindly driving their citizens into poverty. Yet, on a micro-logistical scale, their record-keeping and state planning were astonishingly meticulous.
We know this because of the Persepolis fortification and treasury archives.
The archives. This is one of those discoveries that completely changes how we view an ancient society. We often picture ancient empires through the lens of grand monuments and dramatic battles.
But these archives are thousands of clay tablets, written mostly in cuneiform Elamite, alongside Aramaic and other languages, that document the absolute minutiae of daily administration.
They are essentially ancient spreadsheets.
Yeah, the sources highlight the Helmi tablets, which document an elaborate empire-wide ration and voucher system. They aren't recording poetry, they are recording how much flour went to this baker or how much meat was distributed to that garrison.
One detail from the sources that just floors me is the tracking of specific supplies for multi-ethnic labor forces. They explicitly document the distribution of beer and sesame to Assyrian workers, referred to as ashur.
Imagine the level of bureaucratic control it takes to trap a shipment of beer to a specific ethnic working group in a specific town thousands of years before computers.
It is nuts. It demonstrates a state that was deeply involved in the daily survival of its subjects, at least those employed by the crown. And that logistical mastery extended directly into their infrastructure.
Right, because to make this vast empire function, to move those auditors and that silver, they needed a circulatory system. They built the Royal Road.
A 2,500-kilometer highway system connecting the capital of Susa all the way to Sardis in western Asia Minor. It wasn't just a dirt path. It was a highly managed, secure arterial route.
And the true innovation of the Royal Road was the courier relay system, the Piradazis. Every 15 to 20 miles along this route, the state maintained relay stations equipped with fresh horses, food, and lodging.
Okay, let's break down how the Piradazzi actually function because it's so cool. If you are a royal courier carrying an urgent message from the great king, you ride your horse at a full gallop from the first station to the second. You don't stop to rest.
When you arrive, a fresh horse and a fresh rider are already waiting.
He takes the dispatch pouch, mounts the fresh horse, and immediately takes off for the third station.
It was a continuous, uninterrupted chain of movement day and night through snow, rain, and heat. By using this relay, a message could travel from Susa to Sardis in roughly 15 days.
For a normal traveler, walking or taking a caravan, that same journey would take 90 days. They compressed the communication time of their empire by a factor of 6.
It's the ancient world's version of fiber optic broadband, and they applied that same level of engineering genius to their environment. The Iranian plateau is largely arid. To support a massive population and generate the agricultural surplus needed to feed their cities, they had to master hydrology.
They built the qanats.
The engineering behind a qanat is brilliant because it works with the harsh environment rather than fighting it. If you have an aquifer at the base of a mountain and you want to move that water to a dry plain 10 miles away, you can't just dig a surface canal.
Right, the intense desert sun will evaporate the water before it ever reaches the crops.
So they go underground. They dig a subterranean channel, perfectly sloped, so that gravity gently pulls the water down from the mountain aquifer all the way to the agricultural basin.
And they dig vertical access shafts every 20 or 30 meters to provide ventilation and remove excavated dirt. It is a staggering amount of highly skilled, dangerous manual labor.
And because it was so labor-intensive, the central state had to figure out a way to incentivize it. They couldn't just order people to dig tunnels in the dark for years on end.
The sources note that the Achaemenid crown introduced a powerful economic policy. Anyone who financed and built a new qanat, bringing dead land to life, was granted the right to retain the profits from that irrigated land for 5 generations.
A 5-generation tax break, that is an incredible use of state policy to spur private infrastructure development. You invest the capital and the labor now, and your great-great-great-grandchildren will still be reaping the economic benefits.
It fundamentally transformed the agricultural capacity of the plateau.
And with mastery over water came mastery over temperature. Which brings us back to the image you started with, the Yakshals.
The desert ice domes. I am obsessed with these.
They are an absolute marvel of ancient thermodynamics. The structure itself is a massive stepped dome made of a special mortar called sarud. It's a mixture of sand, clay, egg whites, lime, goat hair, and ash in specific proportions.
Which sounds weird, but it was highly resistant to heat transfer and completely water impermeable.
Yes, and here is how they actually harvested the ice. In the winter, when the desert nights dropped below freezing, they would channel water from the Canuts into shallow shaded pools just outside the Akshal.
The water would freeze overnight. Before the sun could melt it, laborers would chop the ice into blocks and carry it down into the deep subterranean trench inside the dome.
And to keep it from melting during the scorching summer, the Yakshal was equipped with badger, or wind catchers. These tall towers would catch the slightest breeze, funnel it down into the subterranean chamber to cool the air, and force the warmer air out through a hole in the top of the dome.
Evaporative cooling,
Hmm.
driven entirely by passive architecture. So the great king could sit in his palace in the middle of July in a desert basin and demand a bowl of chilled fruit or a cold drink, and it would be brought to him.
It is the ultimate display of imperial luxury and environmental dominance. But there is. Even the most brilliant engineering and the most meticulously audited bureaucracy cannot save a system that has fundamentally weakened its own foundations.
Exactly. You have an empire that is technologically advanced but macroeconomically fragile. The silver hoarding has drained the local economies, the massive military is expensive to maintain, and the sheer scale of the territory is constantly testing the limits of centralized control.
And into this precarious situation walks Alexander the Great.
Right. By 330 BC, Alexander sweeps through the Achaemenid Empire, he defeats Darius III, burns Persepolis, and the first global superpower is totally dismantled. The pendulum swings rapidly away from Persian centralization.
Which brings us to a really fascinating transition period. The Hellenistic interval running from roughly 330 BC to the mid-2nd century BC.
Alexander dies young. His generals carve up his massive conquests, and the Seleucid Empire takes control over Mesopotamia and the Iranian Plateau, lasting from 312 to 64 BC.
Now, the Seleucids are a Greek ruling class trying to govern a massive, deeply ancient, multi-ethnic territory, and they realize very quickly that they cannot simply replace the Persian system with a purely Greek one.
So they develop a dual administrative framework. Our sources outline this clearly. In the major urban centers, the Seleucids establish polis. These are self-governing Greek city-states, complete with gymnasiums, theaters, and Greek magistrates.
These cities operate as islands of Hellenistic culture and power. But outside of those cities, in the vast rural hinterlands, the Seleucids leave the traditional native satrapies largely intact.
Because they just don't have the manpower or the cultural capital to micromanage the daily lives of the rural Iranian populations.
Exactly. And this dual system creates a fascinating dynamic, particularly in a region called Persis, or Fars, which is the ancestral cultural heartland of the Persian people.
It's the region surrounding the ruins of Persepolis.
Because the Seleucids' grip on this rural area is so loose and indirect, it allows a very specific group of local dynasts to rise to power.
These local rulers adopt the Aramaic title Frateraka. Originally, under the Achaemenids, a Frateraka was just a sub-satrapal district governor. But under the Seleucids, these new dynast men, identified in the sources as Beydad, Ardekshir the Vars, and Vadverdata Ardeka, they begin ruling from a city called Estakhr, just a few miles from the burned remains of Persepolis.
They are sitting in the shadow of their ancestors' greatest monument, technically serving a Greek king, but functionally running their own show.
It reminds me of a corporate buyout, where a massive conglomerate takes over a boutique firm. But the boutique firm's office is 3 time zones away, so the parent company rarely checks in. The local branch just keeps doing things their own way, using their old systems, until eventually they barely remember who the parent company is.
That's a great analogy, and this raises an important question. How do they broadcast that growing independence? They don't immediately raise an army and declare war on the Seleucids. That would be suicide.
Right.
Instead, they wage a quiet, persistent campaign of cultural resistance, using the most powerful mass media tool of the ancient world.
Coinage. I love this detail from the research. The Frateraka begin minting their own silver coins. And in antiquity, a coin isn't just a unit of economic exchange. It is a billboard that passes through thousands of hands every single day. If you want to tell your people who's really in charge, you put it on the money.
The visual iconography of these Frateraka coins is a masterclass in subtle subversion. On the obverse, the front of the coin, you see the portrait of the ruler. He is wearing the Hellenistic diadem, which is a thin headband that serves as the universal symbol of Greek royal authority. It's a nod to their Seleucid overlords.
Basically saying, look, we are playing by the rules. We acknowledge the Greeks.
Exactly. But, perched right on top of that Hellenistic diadem, the ruler is wearing the kirbasia, the traditional floppy-topped Persian side-of-ball tiara. They are literally layering their indigenous Iranian identity over the top of the imposed Greek authority.
They're blending the fashions of the conqueror and the conquered on a single piece of silver. It's so smart. But the reverse side of the coin is where they really make their statement. It's not subtle at all.
On the reverse, the coin depicts the dynast standing in a posture of reverence before a traditional Zoroastrian fire temple. And hovering above the temple is the half-figure representation of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of the Zoroastrian faith.
Imagine being a Persian farmer or merchant in 200 BC. You're surrounded by Greek administrators and Greek soldiers in the big cities. But when you trade your barley for silver, you look at the coin in your palm, and it shows a Persian leader wearing a Persian hat, worshiping at a Persian fire temple under a Persian god.
It is a daily physical reminder that their culture has not been erased.
It is the preservation of cultural memory under occupation. And this quiet propaganda works. As the Seleucid Empire begins to disintegrate over the next century, torn apart by internal civil wars and immense pressure from the expanding Roman Republic in the West, the Frateraka leveraged their consolidated local power.
By roughly 150 BC, they achieved complete independence. They kept the flame alive.
But while these dynasts in the South were playing the long game of quiet cultural preservation, a completely different kind of force was gathering in the northeastern steppes. A force that was about to shatter the Hellenistic world entirely and swing the pendulum of governance violently back toward decentralization.
This is the rise of the Parthian Empire, also known as the Arsacid Empire, which will dominate the region from 247 BC all the way to 224 AD. The story begins with a man named Arsaces I.
Arsaces is the leader of the Parni, a nomadic tribe belonging to the larger Dahe Confederation from the Central Asian steppes. They are tough, highly mobile horsemen, and in the mid-3rd century BC, they sweep down and seize the northeastern Seleucid satrapy of Parthia.
They establish a foothold, but they don't stop there. Over the next 2 centuries, subsequent Parthian kings, specifically Mithridates I and Mithridates II, systematically dismantle the remnants of the Seleucid state.
They push westward, absorb the incredibly wealthy region of Mesopotamia, and establish Parthia as a massive multi-regional superpower.
But here is the critical pivot in our story. When the Parthians build their superpower, they look at the hyper-centralized Achaemenid model, the audits, the fixed taxes, the total crown control, and they completely reject it. The Arsacids build their empire on a foundation of radical decentralization and feudalism.
They assumed the grand, ancient title of Shahanshah, King of Kings. But under the Parthian system, that title was literal. They permitted regional vassal kings to maintain their own courts, command their own armies, and govern their own territories with massive autonomy.
The sources mention that vassals in regions like Persis and Elymais were even allowed to mint their own localized currency. This is the exact opposite of Darius the Great hoarding all the standardized silver in Susa.
The Parthian King of Kings is basically saying, you run your kingdom, you keep your money, just acknowledge me as the boss and send your cavalry when I call.
It is a true feudal confederation. Power at the top was balanced by an institution called the Megisthenes. This was an assembly of high nobility, heavily dominated by exceptionally powerful aristocratic clans, specifically the Surin and the Karen families.
Wait a minute, I need to stop and ask a mechanical question here. Because we just spent the entire first half of this deep dive establishing that a strong, centralized bureaucracy, splitting civil and military power, auditing everyone constantly, was the ultimate way to run a massive empire.
Right, it seems contradictory.
Yeah, how on earth did a decentralized king of kings with these massive noble families running their own estates not immediately tear itself apart in civil war?
It's all about economic geography. The Parthian Empire's stability was underwritten by its location. They sat squarely astride the most lucrative trade network in the ancient world, the Silk Road.
Ah, they controlled the vast overland transit routes connecting Han Dynasty China in the east to the Roman Mediterranean in the west.
Exactly. They didn't need to build a crushing, centralized tax bureaucracy to extract agricultural wealth from their own peasants because they could just tax global transit.
They are the toll booth of the ancient world.
Precisely. Han China is exporting highly sought-after silk and pearls. West Asia and Rome are trading glassware, fine leathers, Indian iron, perfumes, and spices. The goods have to cross Parthian territory.
And the sources point out that Eastern Iranian-speaking Sogdian merchants served as the primary commercial links across this Eurasian corridor. So the Parthian state is growing immensely wealthy simply by regulating, protecting, and taxing these massive merchant caravans.
When a state has an external flow of massive wealth like that, it relieves the internal pressure. The King of Kings can afford to let the Surin clan be rich and autonomous because the king is getting incredibly rich off the transit taxes.
Agility and decentralization actually work better for managing a diverse, dynamic trade empire than a rigid bureaucracy would have.
And that agility extended to the royal court itself. The Parthian kings didn't just sit in one monumental capital year-round. The sources describe a seasonal, mobile court that shifted across multiple administrative centers: Nisa, Ctesiphon, Ecbatana, Rages, and Susa.
They physically moved the center of government to maintain ties with different regions and tribes throughout the year. It's a very nomadic, flexible approach to power.
But of course, when you control the most lucrative trade routes on Earth, you attract the attention of the other massive superpower next door, the Roman Empire.
Right. Rome is expanding eastward, and they want direct control of that wealth. This sparks centuries of conflict, and this is where the Parthian feudal system proves its absolute military genius. Let's get into the Parthian military machine because it completely redefines ancient warfare.
Unlike the Romans, who rely on massive, disciplined blocks of heavy infantry marching in unison, the Parthian military is almost entirely cavalry-centric.
And they operate on a highly specialized combined arms doctrine that relies on two distinct types of riders.
The first component is the cataphracts. These were the elite, heavily armored cavalry drawn from the high nobility.
The sources mention they rode Nicaean war horses. Let's talk about the logistics of that, because this ties directly back to feudalism. To breed horses large enough and strong enough to carry a man covered head to toe in scale armor, along with armor for the horse itself, requires massive, dedicated grazing lands and generations of selective breeding.
A centralized state struggles to maintain that kind of highly specialized, localized breeding program. But an autonomous feudal lord who owns vast tracts of land and derives his prestige from his cavalry can absolutely perfect it.
So the regional lords bred these massive Nicaean horses, and they armed their cataphract riders with heavy swords and long lances called contos.
Their job is shock combat. They're designed to crash directly through enemy lines, shattering the tight formations of Hellenistic pikemen or Roman legionnaires.
But a wall of heavy armor is slow. The cataphracts alone wouldn't have been enough to defeat Rome. The magic happens when you pair them with the second component, the horse archers.
The horse archers were drawn from the later semi-nomadic tribes and lower nobility. They wore little to no armor, making them incredibly fast, and they were armed with the composite recurve bow, which was a devastating weapon capable of piercing armor at close range.
And these riders developed one of the most famous and psychologically devastating tactical maneuvers in the history of warfare, the Parthian shot.
It is a maneuver that requires a lifetime in the saddle to master. It exploits the fundamental weakness of slow, heavy infantry.
Let's put the listener in the sandals of a Roman soldier for a second. You are marching across the arid plains of Mesopotamia. You are wearing heavy armor, carrying a massive shield, trying to maintain a rigid formation. Suddenly, a swarm of Parthian horse archers descends on you.
They're riding in circles, raining arrows down on your unit. It is chaotic and terrifying.
But then, suddenly, the Parthian riders break off. They turn their horses and flee at a full gallop. If you are that Roman commander, you think you've won. You think their morale broke.
So you give the order to break formation and charge after them, to cut them down as they retreat. Your men start running, spreading out, losing the protection of their shield wall, and then the impossible happens.
What do?
Without slowing their horses down in the slightest, the Parthian riders turn their bodies 180 degrees in the saddle. They are now facing backward, riding at full speed away from the Romans, and they draw their composite bows.
They unleash a lethal, perfectly aimed volley of arrows directly backward into the faces of the pursuing, disorganized Roman troops. It is a slaughter.
The Romans were trained for rigid, close quarters, grinding combat. The Parthians used space, speed, deception, and biomechanical mastery to absolutely dismantle them.
The historical results of this doctrine were catastrophic for Rome. Our sources highlight the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC. The Roman general Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Roman history, marches a massive army of legions into Parthian territory expecting an easy conquest.
And he is met by a Parthian force composed almost entirely of cavalry, led by a commander from the Surin clan.
The feudal lords flex their muscle.
Exactly. Crassus's legions are completely obliterated by the combination of horse archers and cataphract charges. Crassus himself is killed. It is one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman history.
And it wasn't a fluke. A few decades later, in 36 BC, Mark Antony attempts a massive invasion of Media, and he too is forced into a disastrous, freezing retreat, losing tens of thousands of men to Parthian hit-and-run tactics.
The decentralized feudal confederation proved that it could completely dismantle the centralized bureaucratic Roman war machine. The Parthians dominated the Silk Road and held Rome at bay for nearly 4 centuries.
But, and there was always a but, in history, feudalism has an inherent fatal flaw built into its very DNA.
It does. It relies entirely on the delicate balance of power between the central king and the regional lords. When the King of Kings is strong, wealthy, and successful in war, the lords remain loyal.
But when the central authority weakens, the pendulum gets ready to swing again. By the early 3rd century AD, the Parthian state is bleeding out. They have suffered through chronic, grinding wars with Rome, who occasionally manage to sack their capital at Ctesiphon, and they are torn apart by internal dynastic civil wars between rival claimants to the Arsacid throne.
The central authority is distracted and depleted, and in a feudal system, a weak king is blood in the water. If you have granted your regional vassals massive autonomy, their own standing armies, and the right to mint their own money, they have all the tools they need to replace you.
Which brings us to the final massive shift in our deep dive, the early Sasanian Empire spanning from 294 AD to 300 AD. The Parthian King of Kings, Artabanus IV, is severely weakened, and seizing this exact opportunity is a local governor from our old friend, the southern province of Pars.
A man named Popak begins consolidating regional control, acting aggressively independent. And it is Popak's son, Ardashir I, who takes the final decisive step.
Ardashir defeats his own brother, Shapur, to consolidate absolute control over Pars. He then systematically conquers the neighboring vassal states, building his own massive power base right under the nose of the Parthian king. Finally, he challenges Artabanus V directly.
This culminates in the Battle of Hormozgan in 224 AD. The rebel vassal meets the King of Kings on the battlefield. Artabanus is killed. The Arsacid dynasty, which had ruled for nearly 500 years, is abruptly, violently ended.
Ardashir marches into Skersan and is crowned the new Shahanshah. And Ardashir fundamentally rebrands the state. He declares the restoration of a unified, centralized Persian empire, and he officially names it Ardashir, the empire of the Iranians.
So Ardashir is a rebel who used the extreme autonomy of the Parthian feudal system to build an army and overthrow the king. What is the very first thing he does once he sits on the throne?
He looks at the system that allowed him to take power, and he completely destroys it. He understands that if he leaves the feudal structure intact, another ambitious lord from another province will do exactly what he just did.
It is the ultimate pulling up of the ladder behind you. He initiates a massive, systematic counter-revolution to dismantle decentralization.
So what does this all mean? The Sasanians abolish the autonomous vassal kings. You don't get to run your own court anymore. You don't get to mint your own coins.
Instead, Ardashir and his son, Shapur III, replaced those local dynasts with appointed royal bureaucrats and governors who answered directly and only to the central court in Ctesiphon. They reinstalled a heavy, top-down bureaucracy that the Parthians had abandoned.
The sources detail an entirely new, incredibly rigid organizational chart for the empire. Below the Shahanshah, you have the Wuzurg Framadar, who acts as the Grand Vizier or Prime Minister, managing the entire state apparatus.
You have the Mobadan Mobad, the supreme Zoroastrian high priest, the Spabed, the commander-in-chief of the unified military, and the Wastriyawa Salar, the Minister of Agriculture, overseeing a newly centralized tax collection system.
But Ardashir knew that simply drawing a new org chart wouldn't strip the old high nobility families like the Surin clan of their ingrained military power. To truly break their monopoly on the cavalry, the Sasanians engineered a brilliant social reform. They elevated a new class of minor gentry called the Daquans.
Let's break down how this structural shift worked, because it's a genius move for centralizing a military. Previously, the great lords raised the armies from their massive estates. If the king wanted cavalry, he had to ask the lords nicely.
Right. But under the new Sasanian system, these minor Daquans, who owned smaller parcels of land and served as local administrators, were tasked with providing the elite armored cavalry forces, which were now called the Severon.
But here's the critical difference. These Svaran knights were no longer loyal to a regional lord. They were paid directly from the royal treasury.
The Sasanians severed the age-old feudal link between the soldier and the regional aristocrat, binding the military's financial loyalty directly to the crown. It was an incredibly effective way to centralize hard power.
But hard power military and bureaucracy is only half the equation. To truly legitimize a violent coup and ensure long-term stability, you need soft power. You need ideology. And this is where the Sasanian era takes a remarkably dark and fascinating turn.
It's like a ruthless tech founder coming into a messy, decentralized startup, imposing absolute top-down control, and installing a very strict, mandatory HR ideology. Because historically, as we've seen, the empires of the Iranian plateau, the Achaemenids and the Parthians, were characterized by a deep, pragmatic tolerance of local faiths.
The Sasanians violently reject this model. They realize that a centralized state requires a centralized ideology. So they actively, intentionally fuse the state apparatus with an orthodox, rigid version of Zoroastrianism.
They weaponize religion for statecraft. The sources introduce us to a high priest named Tanzar, sometimes referred to as Tozar, who operates under Ardashir I. Tanzar is given a monumental task, standardizing the faith.
Before this, Zoroastrian traditions were largely oral, with diverse regional variations and practices. Tanzar embarks on compiling and authorizing a singular, definitive, state-sanctioned recension of the Avesta, the Holy Scriptures. He is deciding what is officially holy, and by extension, what is officially heresy.
Now, as a quick note for our listeners, we are just impartially reporting on what the sources say about these power struggles and religious shifts. We aren't taking any sides here, just tracking the historical pendulum. But what Tanzar does is wild. The sources mention the famous Letter of Tanzar. In this document, he actively attacks the previous Parthian religious practices, labeling them as decayed and heterodox.
He creates a narrative that justifies Ardashir's violent coup not as a political power grab, but as a holy crusade to restore a corrupted faith.
It is a brilliant, terrifying political maneuver. If the king's authority comes directly from the one true Orthodox interpretation of God, then rebelling against the king isn't just treason, it is blasphemy.
And this centralization of faith accelerates dramatically under a priest named Kartir. Kartir's rise to power is unprecedented. He serves under several early Sasanian kings and becomes so phenomenally powerful that he's the only commoner in the entire history of the empire permitted to carve his own rock inscriptions in the royal fashion.
You can still see them today at Nakhi Rostam and the Kabi Zartusht.
Kartir's mission was absolute religious conformity. Shapur grants him immense authority, and Kartir uses it to subordinate all the regional independent clergies across the empire to his own priesthood based in Pars.
How does he actually enforce that on the ground?
By controlling the sacred spaces, he launched a systematic campaign to extinguish local independent cult shrines and replace them with state-sanctioned Bahram fires.
A Parang fire is the highest grade of sacred fire in Zoroastrianism, right?
Exactly, and by centralizing their establishment, Kartir ensured that the state controlled the focal points of worship in every major city.
And this is where the pendulum swings into rigid intolerance. Kartir doesn't just organize his own religion, he initiates the periodic, state-sponsored persecution of religious minorities, Jews, Christians, Buddhists, and Hindus living within the empire's borders. The state demands ideological purity.
Now, there is a crucial nuance here that we must explore. The shift to absolute violent orthodoxy wasn't instantaneous. Shapur I, who rules from 241 to 271 AD, is a massive figure in this era. He is the king who consolidated the empire and projected its power outward. And during his lifetime, despite empowering Kartir, Shapur personally maintained a degree of the old Persian tolerance.
Shapur's reign is fascinating because he is balancing this internal religious restructuring with massive external warfare. He initiates massive military campaigns against the Roman Empire. He marches into Roman Syria and Mesopotamia, equipped with those newly centralized, heavily armored Severan knights and even war elephants.
And his campaigns culminate in an event that sent absolute shockwaves across the ancient world. In 260 AD, at the Battle of Edessa, Shapur crushes the Roman army and captures the Roman Emperor Valerian alive.
It is impossible to overstate how significant this is. It is the first time in history a Roman emperor is taken alive in battle.
It completely shatters the myth of Roman invincibility.
And Shapur knows exactly how valuable this is for propaganda. He has this triumph immortalized in the monumental rock reliefs at Nakhi. It depicts Valerian kneeling in submission before Shapur, who is seated on his massive war horse. It is the ultimate visual flex of the ancient world.
Literally saying, look at what our new centralized state can achieve. And Shapur was highly pragmatic with his conquests. He didn't just capture Valerian, he took tens of thousands of Roman legionnaires and engineers as prisoners of war.
But he didn't just throw them in dungeons. He forcibly resettled them deep inside the Sasanian Empire, using their labor and engineering expertise to build entirely new cities like Bishapur and Nishapur.
The sources specifically note that these Roman TOWs were used to construct the Bandi Kaisar, a massive dam and bridge complex in Shushtar. Shapur is literally using the manpower of his defeated rival to upgrade his own empire's infrastructure. It is ruthless, but highly effective statecraft.
But while Shapur is achieving these military and engineering triumphs, a major religious movement is brewing within his borders. A movement that will test the limits of his pragmatic tolerance and ultimately reveal the terrifying power of Kartir's orthodoxy.
This is the story of Mani. In 3rd century Babylon, this prophet named Mani founds a new religion, Manichaeism. He synthesizes elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and various Gnostic traditions into this massive dualistic cosmic philosophy. It is a highly syncretic, open religion that seeks to bridge different cultures.
And initially under Shapur I, Mani is allowed to preach. In fact, the sources indicate that Shapur actually befriended Mani. Shapur also maintained a close friendship with the Jewish rabbi Samuel of Nahardia, which allowed the Jewish academies in Mesopotamia to flourish during his reign. Shapur saw the value in keeping his diverse subjects relatively content.
He understood the old Achaemenid lesson, you catch more flies with honey than with religious persecution. But that tolerance was tied entirely to Shapur's personal pragmatism. It wasn't built into the structure of the new Sasanian state.
Exactly. The tragedy of Mani perfectly illustrates how quickly a centralized state can turn its ideological weapons against its own people. When Shapur dies, his successors, Bahram I and Bahram II, lack his immense personal authority. They fall under the intense, dominating influence of the high priest Kartir.
And Kartir sees Manichaeism not as a quirky new philosophy, but as a direct, existential threat to his unified, orthodox state church. The religious climate abruptly and violently shifts. The protective umbrella of the king is removed.
In 274 AD, facing immense pressure from Kartir and the Orthodox priesthood, King Bahram I orders the arrest and execution of Mani.
And it isn't just one man. The state initiates severe, sweeping persecutions against Mani's followers. They actively attempt to eradicate the religion from their borders.
It is a stark demonstration of how statecraft and religion have become dangerously, inextricably intertwined. The Sasanian state now demanded absolute conformity. They didn't just want your taxes in standardized silver, and they didn't just want your military service in the Severan cavalry. They demanded total allegiance in your personal belief.
By the year 300 AD, where our sources conclude this timeline, the early Sasanian state has fundamentally transformed the Iranian plateau. They have codified a single, rigid set of sacred scriptures. They have heavily centralized their administrative and tax apparatus, tearing down the feudal lords. They have established a state-paid military that is the premier armored cavalry force of late antiquity.
They built a massive, cohesive ideological fortress, and they set the stage for a brutal, multi-century imperial rivalry with Rome and later the Byzantine Empire that would shape the geopolitics of the Middle East for hundreds of years.
But they did it by completely reversing the models that came before them.
They really did. So let's take a step back and look at this incredible narrative through line we've traced today. Over 2 millennia, we've watched the ultimate pendulum swing back and forth across the Iranian plateau. We started with the fragmented, decentralized Median tribes, forming a temporary, desperate neighborhood watch to survive the Assyrians.
Then the pendulum swung to the Achaemenids. Cyrus and Darius built a hyper-centralized superpower, utilizing brilliant logistics, postal relays, and audits, but ultimately triggering a crushing macroeconomic deflation by hoarding all the silver.
Then, after Alexander burns it down and the Hellenistic Greeks try to rule through a dual system, the Phartarka quietly keep the culture alive on pocket change.
Until the Parthians ride out of the steppes and violently swing the pendulum back to decentralization. They build a massive feudal confederation, taxing the Silk Road and using autonomous noble cavalry to obliterate Roman legions with the Parthian shot.
But that very feudal autonomy allows a local vassal named Ardashir to rise up, kill the king, and swing the pendulum all the way back to the authoritarian, orthodox, highly centralized Sasanian state where priests dictate policy and the steppe demands total conformity.
It is a remarkable historical laboratory, and what it shows us fundamentally is that there is no end of history. There is no final, perfect blueprint for governance. Human organization is dynamic, and every solution eventually breeds its own unique crisis.
And that is what connects this ancient history directly to you listening to this today. The struggles of these ancient empires are not just abstract trivia. Managing massive flows of information across continents, dealing with the unintended economic fallout of taxation, figuring out how to preserve corporate or cultural identity under pressure, balancing the need for central oversight with the requirement for regional agility, these are the exact same struggles we deal with in modern global supply chains, international law, and geopolitics today.
They truly are. The technology changes, but the structural mechanics of human power remain remarkably consistent. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive. Look closely at the mechanics of the sources we've discussed today. Every single one of these empires eventually fell or was overthrown. But crucially, they didn't just fall because an outside invader was stronger. They fell because an internal system, a specific mechanism that originally made them powerful, was taken to its absolute logical extreme.
Okay, unpack that for a second.
Think about it. The Achaemenids' brilliant, standardized tax system, designed to fund and stabilize the state, led directly to the systemic silver hoarding that drained their own local economies and alienated their subjects, making them vulnerable to Alexander.
Right.
The Parthians' incredibly flexible feudalism, which gave them the specialized Nicaean cavalry needed to defeat Rome, eventually allowed their own regional vassals to grow too powerful and overthrow the central throne.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And the Sasanians' rigid, unifying orthodoxy, designed to glue the fractured together after the Parthian collapse, ultimately alienated vast swaths of their own population through persecution.
So if a civilization's greatest structural strength always evolves into its fatal flaw when taken to the extreme, we have to look at our modern global systems today.
We do. What is our modern equivalent of silver hoarding? What is our hyper-efficient system that is quietly draining the liquidity and vitality out of our local communities? What is our feudal reliance? Where have we outsourced so much critical infrastructure to autonomous entities that the central authority can no longer control them?
And who are the forces waiting just on the edge of our plateau, adapting to our rigidities, ready to step into the vacuum when our pendulum inevitably swings again?
It is a question every civilization has to answer, eventually.
You know, usually when we set out to build something massive, we want that clean, simple blueprint. We want the one perfect formula that guarantees success forever. But history isn't a blueprint, it's a pendulum. And survival means knowing when it's about to swing. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the sources today. Keep questioning the systems around you, keep looking for the historical cracks in the armor, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.